Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We're excited to have SD Joshi here talking about H.P. Lovecraft and cosmic horror. Um, SD Joshi is a leading authority on H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, H.L. Mencken, and other writers, mostly in the realms of supernatural and fantasy fiction. He has edited corrected versions of the works of Lovecraft, several annotated editions of Bierce and Mencken, and has written such critical studies as The Weird Tale and The Modern Weird Tale. His award-winning biography, H.P. Lovecraft: A Life, has already become a collector's item. An expanded and updated version, I Am Providence: The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft, was published in 2 volumes in 2010. And we'll get to his talk here. Okay. Yeah, I think you want to get started.
Yeah. So Lovecraft is often thought of as kind of the founder or originator of cosmic horror. Now, I'm not sure that's exactly the case, but clearly he made it central to his own vision of what weird fiction is and ought to be. Um, in fact, I want to read you a famous quotation now from one of his letters that gets to the heart of what he was trying to do in weird fiction. And this is a letter he wrote to Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales magazine, where a lot of his stuff was published. And Wright had initially, when Lovecraft had submitted the story Call of Cthulhu, which was like the first story of the Cthulhu mythos, to Wright in this fall of 1926, Wright rejected the story because I think it was too different, too beyond his imagination. He just couldn't understand it, so he rejected it. Then later on, about a year later, Rice said, "Oh well, why don't you send the story back to me? Maybe I'll have a different view about it." And Lovecraft did, but had sent this cover letter in which he said this: "Now all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. To me, there is nothing but puerility in a tale in which the human form and the local human passions and conditions and standards are depicted as native to other worlds or other universes. To achieve the essence of real externality, whether of time or space or dimension, one must forget that such things as organic life, good and evil, love and hate, and all such local attributes of a negligible and temporary race called mankind have any existence at all." A tremendous utterance. Now, you can say, "Oh, I'm not sure every single story of Lovecraft's is cosmic in this sense, but a lot of them clearly are. It just goes to show the 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 goal that he set for himself, and indeed achieved in most of his stories, especially of the last decade of his life. Now, it's worth pointing out there seem to be two different types of cosmicism. One is the cosmicism of space, that is to say, the depiction of the vastness of the universe, in which our little planet is just like an ink blot on the back door of the universe. Or as as Voltaire once said, I think he said something like that we are ants dancing on a grain of sand. Then there's also the cosmicism of time, that is to say, the extent of cosmic history, again, in which we human beings and our entire history occupy an utterly negligible uh, place within that cosmic framework of time. Um, these two elements sometimes go together, sometimes not, and Lovecraft worked with both of them. Uh, can we find antecedents in Lovecraft's cosmicism? Yes, we can. Lovecraft thought actually that some of the Gothic novels of the late 18th, early 19th centuries were cosmic. I don't know that we can really say that. He pointed to things like Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin from 1820, in which the theme of eternal life and the curse of having an eternal life is brought forth, and that's the cosmicism of time. Although even then, it's a somewhat limited perspective there. A couple hundred years. Okay, that's not a big deal in terms of cosmic history. But you go to the work of Edgar Allan Poe, a tremendously, innovative writer, but not cosmic fundamentally in his imagination. The human was very important to Poe, and a lot of his ideas or stories focus on the psychology of fear within human beings. So Lovecraft did not believe Poe had a truly cosmic imagination. Uh, what about the other great writers before him? Ambrose Bierce, not really. He was mostly a human-centered writer. Similarly, Arthur Machen. But we come to three different writers just before Lovecraft, or even during Lovecraft's period, that where we can say yes, there are at least elements of cosmicism in there. Let's first talk about William Hope Hodgson. Interesting writer. He only lived like 40 years because he died in a battle toward the end of World War I in 1918. But really, basically, in the first 15 years of the 20th century, he published four novels and a whole bunch of short stories. One of those novels is called The House on the Borderland from 1908, and I think that really is a pioneering work of cosmicism. Even though it is chiefly set in Ireland, and there's a kind of a haunted house situation in Ireland, but at one point the narrator goes on this incredible sort of cosmic vision or something. It's not clear what happens, but he sort of sees in his mind the kind of the vastness of the universe in both space and time, and that's an amazing passage that Lovecraft really liked. But it's difficult to see Hodgson as an antecedent of Lovecraft, in the sense that Lovecraft actually didn't read Hodgson until very late in life. Hodgson's work basically was forgotten for many years after he died, and it was only rediscovered in like the 1930s by this guy named Herman Koenig, who was a Lovecraft's friend, and he was the one who started sort of showing Hodgson's books around and saying, "Hey, look at this forgotten guy. He's a really good writer." And Lovecraft said, "Yeah, he's a good writer," but Lovecraft read him pretty late in life. There's another novel called The Nightland, which is another incredible exercise of the imagination. One of these things of kind of like the Earth in the far future, where humanity is reduced to very small numbers, and there's all sorts of threats and things. And that's an amazingly cosmic piece of work. But again, Lovecraft only read that in 1934 or 35. Two other writers that he did read earlier on in his career we can mention, and that's one of them is Lord Dunsany. I have a particular fondness for Dunsany because I think he's just a tremendous writer. I have been to Dunsany Castle in Ireland and looked at his papers and manuscripts and things. It was a tremendous experience to go there where he himself was, and actually handle his own writings, manuscripts and things. Dunsany started out, actually in most of his career, wrote fantasy, and that's important because even though his imagination was cosmic, especially in his first couple volumes, where he created this whole pantheon of imaginary gods set in this imaginary realm called Pegana or Pegana, I'm not actually sure how you pronounce it, um, because it is set in a fantasy world. There's not the immediacy of horror that we find in Lovecraft, where the cosmicism is set in the real world, with real people and like ourselves. Nevertheless, Lovecraft found great inspiration in Dunsany. In fact, he claimed that his own mythos of gods and creatures was in large part inspired by Dunsany, because Dunsany himself had created this sort of complex pantheon of gods and demigods and worshippers and things that Lovecraft would again utilized, but again put in the real world rather than the fantasy world. The other antecedent of Lovecraft that we know he read and greatly enjoyed is Algernon Blackwood, and there I think we can come upon a really important ancestor of cosmic horror to Lovecraft. take for example The Willows, his best known story, a tremendous story in which these two characters are on a kind of a canoe trip down the Danube and encounter some very strange and indefined creatures along the way. That story, by the way, was based on an actual canoe trip that Blackwood himself undertook. He was a great outdoorsman. He liked camping and boating and things like that. And so he himself, with a friend of his, took very much this canoe trip just as he describes in the story. In fact, there's an article about it that he wrote years before he wrote the story in which he outlines the whole voyage. Of course, he didn't encounter these strange creatures that we find in the story, but they are tremendously cosmic, precisely because they are indefined. We don't know what it is that is haunting these places that the characters come upon. In fact, at one point, one of the characters, a Swede, that's all he's called, the Swede, says, it is our very insignificance that may save us. And that is a quintessentially cosmic utterance. We human beings are so insignificant that maybe these monsters that are all around us will not even pay us any attention. And that's a tremendously potent idea. Lovecraft thought The Willows was like the best horror story ever written, and I am not inclined to disagree with him. That is a tremendous story, and it's clear that it influenced, for example, The Color Out of Space, which is one of Lovecraft's pioneering stories of cosmicism, where again the entities that were apparently embedded in this meteorite from outer space and land on a farm in Massachusetts. We don't know what they are, and not only that, we don't know what their purpose is. That's the importance of that utterance that Lovecraft said, in that letter that I quoted. Not only do we not know their physical qualities, these creatures, if it's more than one creature, we don't even know that, but we don't know what is motivating them. What do they feel the same emotions that we do? What are they after? I mean, it's that sense of the unknown that really creates the sense of cosmicism, because they are so totally alien to our way of thinking and living. Another story by Blackwood called The Wendigo is also powerful, not quite as cosmic, but very powerful story about these campers in the backwoods of Canada, again, and based on actual camping trips that Blackwood himself took in Canada. He spent a couple of years in Canada early in his life, encountering this creature that the natives called the Wendigo. We don't know what it is. Apparently, it's some sort of flying creature that snatches up one of the guys on the trip and bears him off. But who knows what exactly happens. That story clearly influenced Lovecraft's the Dunwich Horror. There are lots of details that Lovecraft took from that story and put in the Dunwich Horror. And Lovecraft wrote Blackwood right around the early 1920s, just when he was sort of maturing out of his early literary phase. In the first decade of Lovecraft's career, he wrote, I wouldn't say conventional stories, but relatively not cosmic stories. Stories influenced by Poe, like The Outsider, by Lord Dunsany, some fantasies of that sort. But the cosmicism that we understand from Lovecraft's later stories, like The Call of Cthulhu, Color of Space, Whisper in Darkness, etc., weren't really present in those early stories. And I have to believe that reading Dunsany and even Mencken to some degree, but certainly Blackwood, started Lovecraft thinking, how can I expand the boundaries of the weird? Because I think he, like Blackwood and others, had come to realize that by this time in literary history, the 1920s, some of the older motifs of Gothic fiction, the werewolf, the vampire, the haunted house, the ghost, these were all played out, not only because they'd been used too many times in fiction before, but because the advance of knowledge had made them implausible to contemporary readers. We could not suspend our disbelief and accept the reality of these entities, even in a work of fiction. And so Lovecraft felt they were aesthetically unusable. So he was fishing around for some other means to convey the sense of horror and weirdness, and he latched on to the depths of space and also of time, whereby things might be very different. He starts getting at this in things like even the story called The Shunned House, which was written in 1924, where he says, this strange creature that is sort of buried in the basement of a house in Providence. We can't define it, and maybe some of the new physics of Einstein and Planck, he mentions these specifically, maybe that will allow us to understand how such a creature could exist. It's not your usual vampire, although it's kind of a psychic vampire, but really not the same as what had been done before in Dracula and whatever else. So he was looking for new ways to convey this sense of the cosmic. And I think Blackwood certainly was a big ancestor or predecessor and a model for how he approached that work in the last decade of his life. His own colleagues, some of them, were also gifted with cosmicism. I think I'd mentioned two in particular, and one of them is Clark Ashton Smith. He came upon Smith in 1922, and fell in love with his poetry first. I mean, Smith is a tremendous weird poet. I mean, I edited his collected poetry in 3 volumes, and it is a masterful work. I mean, not all of it is weird, but a lot of it is, and it's tremendously powerful stuff. And Lovecraft was aware of that. This long poem he wrote called "The Hashish Eater," which is a tremendous exercise of the imagination and truly cosmic in its perspective. That really enchanted Lovecraft. But by the later 1920s, I think in part inspired by Lovecraft himself, or at least by Lovecraft's example, Smith began writing stories for weird tales and other pulps. Again, Smith, like Dunsany, worked in the realm of fantasy more than in the strictly supernatural or weird realm. But nevertheless, there's a certain amount of cosmicism in Smith's work. The other writer that I could point out is Donald Wandrei. He was a younger colleague of Lovecraft. He was born in 1908. He was therefore 18 years younger than Lovecraft. And Lovecraft came upon him when Wandrei was only in his 20s. He actually got in touch with Smith first, and then through Smith, he got in touch with Lovecraft. And Smith and Wandrei started sending these really powerful stories that he was writing, at that time. He was still in college, I believe, at the University of Minnesota. And one of these stories was called The Red Brain. Actually, Wandrei's original title was, let me think, I think it was called The Twilight of Time, which clearly gets the cosmic perspective across. And in fact, it was through Lovecraft's sort of nudging that Farnsworth Wright of Weird Tales accepted this story. That's another story that Wright had rejected because he just couldn't understand it. It blew his mind. But Lovecraft said, this is a really good story. You should take it. And Wright did and published it in 1927. Wandrei went on to write for the science fiction pulps like Astounding Stories and places like that because his imagination was heading in that direction. With a lot of stories about space exploration and things like that. So those Lovecraft was aware that the sense of the cosmic was a rare quality. In fact, he refers in one letter to Smith. He says it's rarer than hen's teeth. That was the expression then. Very rare that even writers of horror fiction or even science fiction, strangely enough, don't seem to have really a sense of the cosmic as Lovecraft understood it, the notion of the vastness of space and time and the resultant inconsequence of human beings and indeed all Earth life. In fact, it's worth exploring a little bit the whole field of science fiction. Canonically, science fiction as a genre became established in 1926 when Amazing Stories magazine was founded. Of course, we had predecessors, even in Poe and Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, tremendous writers of what would later be called science fiction. But Lovecraft felt that even those writers didn't really get to the cosmic because they were still focused on human beings. They were focused on human exploration of outer space, and the sense of the cosmic, by his understanding, really wasn't there. However, certain writers, right after Lovecraft's, the generations or two after Lovecraft's death, may have been influenced by him. There's been some interesting research done lately on how writers like Arthur C. Clarke and Philip K. Dick and Fritz Leiber, who actually knew Lovecraft, and maybe even Frank Herbert and Heinlein might have been influenced by Lovecraft. Let's consider Arthur C. Clarke for a minute. British writer, of course. I think when he was born, 1917, I believe. He wrote an autobiography called Astounding Days, a play on the magazine Astounding Stories. in which he, in an early part, he says, boy, I really love those two stories by Lovecraft that were published in Astounding Stories, and that was At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time, which are really the two premier explorations of cosmicism in Lovecraft's work. I mean, even beyond The Call of Cthulhu or The Color of Space, those two stories represent Lovecraft as a cosmic writer better and more powerfully than any other stories he wrote. And it was those two stories exactly that Clarke fixated upon. And people have scholars have believed that things like Childhood Sin and the novel 1953 and 2001: A Space Odyssey have a significant Lovecraft influence, because the idea there in both those works is the idea of alien species that are somehow nurturing the progress of the human race, or even creating the human race. That is the core element of both of Lovecraft's stories, At the Mountains of Madness and Shadow of Time. In fact, At the Mountains of Madness, which is mostly set in the Antarctic, this one explorer comes upon these remains of these cosmic entities from outer space who had colonized really the whole Earth. And he says, yeah, they created Earth life as a jest or mistake. A pretty misanthropic view of things, that we are simply the accidents of the creation of these entities. And there's an element of that in Arthur C. Clarke's work. And as I say, 2001 really has strong elements of that idea of alien creatures somehow guiding us along the path of evolution. I think more work could be done on tracing Lovecraft's influence on science fiction of the next couple generations after his death. I think there's probably other influences, other writers whom he influenced in that line. In the pure horror field, it's interesting what happened after Lovecraft's death. August Derleth was his great friend and colleague, and was devastated by Lovecraft's early death because he didn't know how sick he was. I mean, nobody did. So when Lovecraft died in 1937, Derleth, who lived in Wisconsin most of his life, was saying, "Oh my God, what do we do now? We gotta, save Lovecraft's work from the oblivion of the pulp magazines." And he established the publishing firm of Arkham House to preserve Lovecraft's work in hardcover, and did a lot of work over the rest of his life to promote Lovecraft, to get Lovecraft, out in British editions and foreign translations. All good work. But I think he fundamentally misunderstood Lovecraft, and specifically this idea of cosmicism, because Derleth fixated on the Cthulhu mythos, a term he coined, by the way, not Lovecraft, but made it a kind of rather naive battle of good entities against bad entities or evil entities. But Lovecraft has none of that in his fiction. There is no good and evil, as Lovecraft said in that letter. We have to discard those kinds of moral perspectives when we write about alien species. They may not conform to our ideas of what good or evil is. But Derleth didn't understand that very well, and so he started writing imitations in which these, evil entities, the old ones, battle the elder gods, whoever they are, who are on the side of humanity. And it's, let me say bluntly, they're not good stories to begin with, and they're certainly not cosmic, because again, the whole focus is on human beings rather than the cosmic perspective. And because Derleth was Lovecraft's friend and publisher and self-styled disciple, everybody started imitating Lovecraft, started imitating Derleth rather than Lovecraft. So you had a lot of people who, during the 40s and 50s and 60s, who were actually imitating Derleth unwittingly rather than imitating Lovecraft. Even so, there are some people who kind of stood out from the crowd, and I think Fritz Leiber is one of them. He, was in touch with Lovecraft by correspondence about the last year, maybe not even a year before Lovecraft's death, and Lovecraft read some of his manuscripts and commented on them, wrote us a long letter about one of his early fantasy stories. And Leiber really appreciated the help that he got from Lovecraft, even in that short period of time. And he went on to write a lot of really good work, fantasy, horror, science fiction, you name it. He was a tremendously versatile writer. and some of his Lovecraftian imitations, or I shouldn't even call them that because that's demeaning, but he used a lot of Lovecraft's ideas in some of his own stories, but made them his own. He was a tremendously original writer and just took elements of Lovecraft and infused them with his own imagination. And there's some powerful works that he wrote. One of them I think is called what is it called now? Um, Let me just check. I wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Cthulhu Mythos, which I chronicle a lot of this stuff. Um, yeah, The Terror from the Depths. That is a great novella. It was first published in one anthology in 1976, and then later on in a volume called Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos in 1990, which Artemis published. A great story, both using Lovecraft in a sense as a character in the story, but also expressing this cosmic perspective. By the 1970s, I think scholarship had advanced to the point where people were saying, Derleth was all wrong about this stuff. He didn't understand Lovecraft. We got to get back to the essence of Lovecraft and the sense of the cosmic, and get rid of these elder gods and things like that. And eventually, I think some writers started following suit. Ramsey Campbell is a very interesting writer from this perspective. English writer, born 1946. He got in touch with Derleth when he was like 15, maybe 15, I guess. Derleth didn't know how young he was at the time. And when Campbell sent some of these early stories that were kind of crude imitations of Lovecraft, Derleth said, well, there's some promise here. But he urged Campbell not to set his stories in Lovecraft's New England in the 20s because Campbell wasn't American. He was English and didn't know anything about the 1920s, didn't know much about America. So Derleth said, Ramsey, why don't you just set your stories in England in the present day? I mean, that's what write what you know. So Campbell did, and he started writing again these imitations that are better than the early stuff that he wrote. And Derleth was cooperative enough that he felt that these early stories should be published, and so a volume came out called The Inhabitant of the Lake in 1964. Campbell was only 18 years old, and people were like, wow, who is this guy? Again, not great stories by any means. But over the next decade or so, Campbell really did a sort of transformation of his whole literary outlook. And by the time of his next volume, Demons by Daylight in 1973, it should have come out earlier, but Derleth's death in 71 sort of delayed the book by a couple of years. Campbell had sort of transformed himself into a really powerful writer, not necessarily cosmic in every way, or at all in some cases, really focused on human relationships and sexuality and complex issues of that sort. But Demons by Daylight is a central volume in the development of contemporary weird fiction. I mean, it's a landmark in many ways. Still out there. I hope you can get it out there if you can find it. And it has a couple Lovecraft imitations that are really powerful, and get across the idea of the cosmic in a way that filters through Campbell's own understanding of human life. And lately, Campbell is still writing. Thankfully, he's in his late 70s, but he's still producing book after book after book. And just a couple of years ago, he wrote a trilogy that he calls the 3 books of, I don't know how you pronounce it, Daoloth, Daoloth. Anyway, that's his final take on Lovecraftian cosmic horror. And the 3 books are The Searching Dead, Born to the Dark, and this last one, The Way of the Worm. I don't know if you can see that. Brilliant books, infusing the cosmic with the human in a way that only Campbell could have done. So that is a great achievement, and it's well worth seeking out those books. I hope they're out there. I think they're in paperback now. Really powerful stuff, and it just shows you how Campbell has developed over the 60 years of a literary career. It's amazing, and he's done other work along that line. He back in 2002 he published a novel called let me think, what was that? The Darkest Part of the Woods, again, set in England, but ultimately based, in a sense, on Lovecraft's novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is set, of course, in New England, but Campbell, again, transfers some of the elements to England, and there's a certain sense of the cosmic there, again, suggesting horrors from, centuries past. So Campbell has done a lot of good work. Who else can I think of? Let me talk about this Canadian writer named Donald Tyson, Tyson. He came to my attention about 10, 15 years ago, I guess. I was compiling these anthologies of Lovecraftian stories called Black Wings. I think the first one came out in 2010, I think. I've done 7 of those anthologies, and I like to think that there's a lot of good stuff in them. Not always cosmic necessarily, but really good Lovecraftian imitations, I hope. And Tyson started writing a lot of good stuff, even way before I met him. One of the things he wrote was a historical novel, of all things, about Abdul al-Hazred, the author of the Necronomicon. In fact, the book is called Al-Hazred, set in in the 8th century in the Middle East, where Al-Hazred lived, and it's a tremendous work. It is so compelling, and does have elements of the cosmic, to be sure, but it's a huge book. It's like 600 pages, but you'd never know it because it reads very, very fast, and oh, you can't put it down, I'll tell you. So seek that book out. It's a really great piece of work. Another writer who did good work was Michael Shea. I knew him slightly. He died about 10 years ago, but he started his career. Well, his first novel, first published novel, was called The Color Out of Time, which was, well, his take, sort of a sequel to The Color of Space. In my estimation, it was not a very good book, but whatever. Incredibly enough, earlier than that, he wrote a novel, a strange title called Mr. Cannyharm. I don't know what that means, actually, but that novel was not published at the time. He wrote it in like the early 80s, and it just sat around in manuscript. And after his death, his widow, Linda, said, found it and said, hey, we should try to get this published. And we did a couple of years ago. A really fine Lovecraftian novel, with elements of the cosmic, but basically set in San Francisco, which is where Shea lived. In fact, set in the 1960s of San Francisco, with the hippies and Haight-Ashbury and all that sort of thing, but with this undercurrent of horror all along. And Shea wrote a lot of short stories that draw upon Lovecraft also, and those are worth seeking out. I think I assembled a volume of them called Demiurge, the collected mythos stories of Michael Shea. That's out there. He had a pretty cosmic imagination, while at the same time, focusing on human concerns as well. Caitlin Kiernan is an interesting story. She started writing right around the turn of the century, I guess. Did a lot of good work, and still is doing good work, although she's not writing as much anymore for whatever reason. She came from Ireland, born in Ireland and settled in the South, I think in Alabama, and then eventually moved up to Rhode Island, Lovecraft's Rhode Island, and wrote a novel called The Red Tree that I think is one of the most powerful Lovecraftian novels you'll ever read. I mean, it's only subtly Lovecraftian. I wouldn't say it's in any sense an imitation, but it is set in Rhode Island. It certainly draws upon Lovecraft, but of course it's still infused with her own distinctive imagination. A really powerful piece of work. And she's written a whole bunch of short stories, including some of which that I published in my anthologies that really, get to the essence of Lovecraft. I think she's a really fine writer of Lovecraftian fiction. Who else can I mention in currently? A lot of good people are doing work. Actually, another writer who has the good luck to live in Rhode Island is Jonathan Thomas. I take special fondness for him because I sort of helped to get him on the map. I remember him coming up to me, kind of almost shivering in his boots when I was giving a lecture at Brown University in 2007, and said, "Can you please read some of my stories?" I said, "Yeah, of course I will." And they were great stories. They were amazing. So I said, "Oh boy, this is good stuff." And again, being in Providence, you're right there, absorbing all the Lovecraft influence from all the stuff that's around, his houses and the places he wrote. Gee, what a lucky guy. He wrote some really, really good stuff, still writing good stuff. One of his collections is called Tempting Providence and Other Stories. The title novel is all about Lovecraft as a character who kind of, comes back to life as a ghost or something like that. Very, very, very well done. And he has written a novel called The Color Over Occam. That's Occam. That's his idea of how the name Arkham got modernized into Occam. But that doesn't matter. This is basically a take on The Color Out of Space, again set in Massachusetts, and it is about as powerful a cosmic novel as you're ever going to find. And luckily, Hippocampus Press has reprinted that book just this year, I believe. And so you can read it after, it came out about 10, 12 years ago and was, very tiny edition and was really hard to find. But now everybody can read it, and it's a great piece of work. And all of Jonathan Thomas's work is really good. What else can I say? There are a lot of writers who do talk about who borrow from Lovecraft, but not all of them are cosmic, which is okay. That's all right. Some of them, a lot of writers have drawn upon the Shadow over Innsmouth, which does have a cosmic element in the sense that here's an idea of these hybrid creatures, or half fish, half frog, who mate with human beings and create an even more weird hybrid species and take over the whole town of Innsmouth in Massachusetts. There's an undercurrent of the cosmic there, although Lovecraft's own Shadow over Innsmouth is basically a study of regional decay. He based it upon the actual town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, which in his day was kind of a decaying backwater, although you'd never know it now because it's all been refurbished as a kind of a resort town. It's beautiful, and probably expensive to live in now. Not remotely like the Innsmouth that Lovecraft saw in 1920s. But a lot of writers have drawn upon the Shadow over Innsmouth. And in fact, we can talk about some films, because film has a way of conveying the cosmic in some ways more powerfully than literature does, because you can see it in front of you. There is a certain film by a fairly well-known director named Guillermo del Toro called The Shape of Water. I believe it won the Academy Award for that year, didn't it? For Best Picture. What is The Shape of Water except the Shadow over Innsmouth? Well, it's more than that, but the core element is the Shadow over Innsmouth, about a hybrid, fish creature who falls in love with a human woman. Not cosmic by any stretch of the imagination, really speaking, but a very well told story, and the Lovecraft influence is profound there. Del Toro has long wanted to do an actual Lovecraft adaptation. In fact, he wanted to adapt At the Mountains of Madness, but it's a long story about why that never happened, and I'm sorry to say probably never will happen, but there it is. Interestingly enough, I'm in touch right now with a young movie filmmaker from Slovakia who is producing an Out of the Mountains of Madness movie. And I'll tell you, from what I've seen of it, it looks good, and it may be a very powerful cosmic film. Probably won't come out for another year or two, but well worth waiting for. So yeah, that's and there are other films. The late Stuart Gordon did a film called Dagon, which essentially is The Shadow over Innsmouth. Has its moments, but I didn't think he fully captured the essence of that story. But well done. Generally speaking. In some ways, films that don't specifically adapt a Lovecraft work are in some ways more successful than films that do, because it's hard to adapt a Lovecraft story and really bring it across. But if you just sort of borrow some elements of it, you can really have some interesting effects. John Carpenter did a film called In the Mouth of Madness, in which, again, a character that's a literary guy, a writer, kind of fusion of Lovecraft and Stephen King gets involved in these cosmic horrors, and that's an interesting film. I think another great film that is undoubtedly Lovecraftian is Underwater. I think that film came out in 2017 also. Really powerful film about what these people in a submarine encounter out there in the depths of the ocean. And they're right at the end, there's a creature that's clearly based on Cthulhu. Speaking of that, Carpenter also did the film called The Thing, which nominally was a remake of an old film from the 50s, which itself was adapted from a science fiction story by John W. Campbell. But in the 1982 version, Carpenter really infused a lot of Lovecraftian elements into it. Again, taken in part from At the Mouths of Madness. So there's definitely a cosmic element there. One of the best specific adaptations of Lovecraft's story is a German production called Die Farbe, which just means the color. A tremendous adaptation of The Color of Space. Not the easiest film to find out there, but I think you can get it. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society has a website, and you can purchase that film from there. It's a tremendous film, even though it takes the Lovecraft story, which is set in the Massachusetts of the 1920s, and transfers it to post World War II Germany. But that's okay. It's a very skillful adaptation. Much better, I'm sorry to say, than the recent Color Out of Space by Richard Stanley, which didn't really do it for me. I'm sorry to say. He should have stuck a little closer to the story, and the film becomes weak exactly when he departs from the story. Whatever, good try. I'm not sure that Mr. Nicolas Cage was well adapted to playing that role, but no matter. Gets an A for effort, I suppose. So, speaking of media, I mean, you have to also talk about Alan Moore, whose graphic novel in 12 parts called Providence is a rich tapestry of Lovecraftian stories, all mingled together. In fact, he draws upon so many things that I become a character. Yes, I am a character in the 12th episode. So you'll see a figure that's based on me doing whatever. I'm not sure what I'm doing exactly, but I am there. I was very gratified that he saw me as worthy of putting into his graphic novel, but there it is. So we have reached the stage where Lovecraft not only is a universal property, I mean, his work has been translated into 35 languages, including, by the way, Arabic and Hebrew and Russian and Chinese and Serbo-Croatian and all sorts of languages you'd never imagine. He is he belongs to the world now, and he belongs to all different sorts of media, whether it be comics and film, literature, television, internet, you name it. He's everywhere now. And we're just hoping that some film guy can make a really powerful Lovecraft adaptation that really gets out there. Still hoping, and we'll see what happens. Well, I have rattled on for far too long without interruption, so let me shut up, and we can take some questions or just have a general discussion.
So Derek asks, what type of questions did Alan Moore want to ask you about Lovecraft?
Well, here's the thing. Alan Moore is a Luddite to end all Luddites. He doesn't work on a computer, he doesn't do internet, he doesn't do any of that sort of stuff. When was this? In 2015, a guy, I was at the Necronomicon convention in Providence, and some guy approached me saying, hey, I'm a friend of Alan Moore's, and he would like to get in touch with you. And the only way I could do that was to get his phone number. In fact, we can see it. This is his Alan Moore's phone number. So I called, he's in England. I called him up, and we had a nice chat. And I'm not sure he asked me any questions, really speaking. And then we exchanged a few letters here and there. Moore is very well read in Lovecraft. He'd read my biography. I'm very flattered with that, but he's read a lot of Lovecraft's works very thoroughly. You can tell that from his comic book. So I don't think he had any. He didn't have any specific questions, I'm not even sure he requested my permission to be in this graphic novel. But I don't care. What does it matter? I was just flattered that I was there. Um, but no, he is very well read in Lovecraft, and even in the scholarship on Lovecraft, which I found pretty impressive.
Well, I wanted to ask, did you have any opinion on the Necronomicon, the anthology film from the 90s?
Uh, I don't have much of a recollection of that, but I don't think it was very good. If I remember it correctly. I mean, let's just say it was not a memorable film. I'm sorry to say, a lot of really bad Lovecraft films. There's something called The Lurking Fear, and there's one or two films called The Unnameable that are just dreadful. Um, uh, if you go on imdb.com and look under Lovecraft, they're like literally hundreds of films. Some of them very short, some of them full length, that have been based on Lovecraft or supposedly credited to Lovecraft, but the great majority of them, I'm sorry to say, are not so good. Oh, Campbell, yeah, somebody asked about that Campbell. Yeah, I'll have to spell it. The three books of Daoloth. That's a creature that Campbell invented, some god or other, which I mean, it's clear the name is clearly a play on Derleth, Daoloth. It's because Campbell to this day retains a very high admiration for Derleth, and just thanking him for, yeah, there it is, thanking him for the advice that he had given to Campbell as a young writer, and it's stuff that really stuck to him, and so he always has a high admiration for Derleth.
And then,
I see Eddie
yeah.
Gumont here is Gumont is here. Why don't you unmute yourself? There you are. Uh,
Oh, I think.
Eddie has written. Has some element of the cosmic. He co-wrote with Horace Smith a superb book just a year or two ago on Lovecraft and astronomy, because that certainly is where Lovecraft's cosmicism came from. Lovecraft says so when he first discovered astronomy in early 1902. He says, "Wow, the awesome worlds of outer space really affected my imagination," and so that's the core of Lovecraft's cosmicism. Ultimately, comes from his study of astronomy. So, Eddie, what do you have to say about
Well,
that?
well, I'll say also Horace is here too, so I don't
Ah,
know if
good.
you see him, but yeah, I mean it's I live right outside of Providence now in Fall River, and so I was able to go explore the Lad Observatory, go through
Mhm.
some of the astronomy department records that are in the Brown Library, and I mean I'm very happy that during the research Horace and I were doing for this book, I made a small Lovecraftian discovery of my own. I found the list of the books that Lovecraft had taken out from the Lad Observatory libraries.
Oh,
It's not often that you make new
wow.
actual like archival discoveries. So not, they weren't wasn't a huge list, but there were a
Mhm.
few of them. So I was very happy to make that discovery. And I mean, yeah, and looking through some of the astronomy books that he read, again, you can see a lot of themes of the ideas of the time in late 19th, early 20th century of the idea of how the solar system formed, how they
Mhm.
thought the solar system would eventually die, how
Yep.
life on Mars, the idea that you had this planet that at least at the time was thought to be full of like an ancient civilization slowly dying. Again, you can see there's the inability of even advanced species to combat the encroach of nature. Ideas of astronomy that very clearly shaped a lot of the themes that are later on in Lovecraft's own writing. And one of my favorite things also is Lovecraft, something that's just in the news the other day with congressional hearings. I won't get into the other political elements of that, but Lovecraft was a UFO debunker. I mean, he didn't use the term UFO, but he saw UFOs, or he identified them as the planet Venus. People around him, didn't quite believe it, but again, it just goes to show that some of the things that are in the news today are things that were going on back then, and I think there's some people tend to think that because Lovecraft, wrote about aliens, he would be a believer, but I think we can be pretty confident Lovecraft would have been a skeptic, a debunker today.
Isn't it the case that even certain landmarks on either the moon or elsewhere are actually named for Lovecraft or named for Cthulhu? Or, isn't that
Yeah,
right?
there's a crater on Mercury. It's Lovecraft crater, which appropriately enough is the south pole of Mercury, and I think it's located right next to a crater named after Nicholas Roerich, who's the Russian artist who's actually quoted by Lovecraft in At the Mountains of Madness. So again, there's a connection there, and there was an area of Pluto that was called Cthulhu Macula, I think, although I believe that's now just been renamed. I guess that was a placeholder name, so it is no longer named that. But for almost a decade, there was that connection on Pluto, which is it's unfortunate that name was ultimately moved on from, but at least it's we still have the Lovecraft crater on Mercury. So
what's pretty amazing is, Lovecraft, of course, identified Pluto with Yuggoth, his planet, and the thing is that came in novella at the Whisper in Darkness, but he had started writing that novella before the actual announcement of the discovery of Pluto. I think that happened in the New York Times on like March 14th of 1930, but Lovecraft started writing it in early 1920s, about a month before. And you can tell in the manuscript he actually revises the story to align with this new discovery. I mean, think about it. It's only the third planet discovered after ancient time, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
And
And
it's
it was a big
appropriate,
deal.
yeah. And Lovecraft, he's one of the first people, not quite but he's one of the first to write about Pluto in fiction, just as Edgar Allan Poe, one of the very first authors to write about Neptune in fiction. So there's a good parallel there. And of course, Pluto is discovered at the observatory that was established by Percival Lowell, and who became prominent for trying to identify canals on Mars. And Lovecraft himself met Percival Lowell in it was 1907 when Lowell came to Brown University. So there is that indirect connection there as well.
So, anything else? Yeah, he wrote a poem to I think on Lowell's death, I think in 1917 or thereabouts. But
Yeah.
no, he actually met Lowell. In fact, it was funny because Lovecraft was a 17-year-old boy at the time, and he had already been writing astronomy articles for the local papers, and he was kind of worried that Lowell would have read some sort of a disparaging remark that Lovecraft had made in one of these columns. Of course, there's no way Lowell could possibly have read that thing in a local paper, but he was a little nervous first meeting Lowell, but.
Well, and yeah, and Lovecraft, later on, he'll say, "Oh, I never believed any of the stuff Lowell said about Mars." But I mean, you can read it. He goes back and forth. At times, he's very credulous about it. And and he has his own astronomy journal, and he's in it. He illustrates his efforts, chart the Martian canals, which, of course, wasn't quite the canals he was charting, but he was buying into it for at least a time.
Sure. It is sort of interesting that Lovecraft, to my mind at least, doesn't really show a lot of influence on Verne or Wells even. I mean, he read those guys, and in fact, I think he, as a kid, he wrote stories in imitation of Jules Verne. We don't have those stories; they're gone. But in his pure fiction, I don't see a lot of influence. Although I think maybe you think differently. Maybe you're going to be writing an article on that subject.
I have, yeah. There is definitely something to be written about Verne more specific. I wrote a short article. It touched a bit on Verne. I mean, he wrote this. He wrote as a child like a space track, basically, a spin on From the Earth to the Moon, which is now lost. And it's I hope maybe someday someone's going to find it in their attic or something, but probably not. But he did write a short story. Is it not the mysterious eye, but the mysterious ship, that kind of like, and then I mean that I think that clearly shows kind of the influence of Verne's style of writing. I mean, not a lot of specific connection, but you can kind of see some of the Verne adventure themes there. But yeah, I mean, in terms of some of the like especially Verne, I think there's not a lot of direct connection with Lovecraft stuff. With Wells, some cases there are. I mean, especially his early science writing, like when he's a teenager. I mean, clearly there's some stuff that very much is coming from specifically First Men in the Moon. I think that seems to be the biggest influence of Wells's work. He says he never read The Time Machine or The War of the Worlds until later in his life. I think until War of the Worlds was reprinted in, was it Astounding? I think. But
Amazing, I think. Amazing
yeah,
story.
amazing. Yes, yeah. But I think there is evidence that he must have read at least parts of it earlier. I mean, I think he makes some references to it in earlier writings before that would have come. So I think even if he didn't read it fully, he must have read at least parts or passages of it. I'm pretty sure.
By the way, there was a question sort of off the subject here. Somebody had asked a question about the hardcover reprint of I Am Providence. I'm sorry to report that probably won't happen. It's available in paperback and I guess in ebook, but it's probably not financially feasible for my publisher Hippocampus to reissue that book in hardcover. I'd love to see another hardcover edition, but I fear that it's not going to happen. I think it's way expensive, the hardcover printing. So I'm sorry about that, but there it is. But yeah, I think I think somebody should go through those early issues of Astounding Stories. He subscribed to it for at least the whole first year, chiefly because he said of the reprints, they did a lot of interesting reprints of older, what was then considered science fiction. And there may be influences there. I think those issues are now available online. I'm not sure
I think
about that.
so, yeah.
I think they are. So I think some interesting work could be done to trace out maybe influences here and there. Oh yeah, Kingfisher. I don't know that writer, but that's interesting. Yeah, I did assemble a collected edition of Mencken's fiction a couple years ago for Hippocampus. It's 3 volumes. He wrote a lot of good stuff, but again, in Lovecraft's view, the work was not really cosmic. Although he thought the white people, which this commentator just mentioned, was probably the second greatest story in weird fiction. And again, there's much to be said for that. But but again, it's the focus is basically human, which is fine. But it's just Lovecraft said, no, this is not cosmic, but it's a great story anyway. And even recent science fiction. Again, science fiction is not my field. I don't read science fiction. I never have. That's just my taste. But they're probably even contemporaries, especially now that Lovecraft is such a big figure in this general field. I bet some contemporary science fiction writers may have been influenced by him in their work.
I'll say one film that I know I guess it's about 10 years old now, is Europa Report, which I think definitely has some Lovecraftian elements. I mean, and elements in a way. And I think that the co-writer of that does a lot of work with Clark Ashton Smith, so that might be the indirect way too.
Yeah. There was a comment here, although I didn't read the whole of it, so I couldn't tell what was being said there. But anyway, I don't know if you can see that.
Oh yeah, it's Lovecraft's influence on UFOs, alien abductions, cryptids.
Well, on that subject, yes, a colleague of mine. I'll be right back. A colleague of mine named Jason Colavito, I presume that's how you pronounce his name, wrote a book. It's hard to see this. The Cult of Alien Gods, H.P. Lovecraft and Extraterrestrial Pop Culture. Came out in 2005, and this book contends that Lovecraft really had a central influence on this whole alien abduction idea that sprung up basically in the 60s and 70s with Eric von Daniken and all these other people. They were actually channeling Lovecraft, and making use of Lovecraft's fiction, sort of unintentionally in some ways. A very compelling book and well worth reading. So if you can get this book, you can take a look at that, and that really explores the subject very thoroughly.
Well, and I'll say also, like, one of the very early UFO researchers in the U.S. in the 50s, 60s, a guy named Donald Kehoe. He published stories in Weird Tales, including issues where Lovecraft's stories are published. So I mean, it's without a doubt Kehoe was reading Lovecraft. I don't know directly how much that may have influenced him, but again, that's one connection. Another very early guy who actually kind of predates the origin of the UFO or the flying saucer, but kind of gets folded in quickly. Richard Shaver, who writes stories of these underground.
Oh, yes.
I mean, he's explicitly citing Lovecraft. He's writing back and forth with August Derleth. He's citing them. He thinks that like Lovecraft was kind of like writing truth in some of his stories. So again, one of these guys who gets folded into very early UFO flying saucer stuff is very interested in Lovecraft. And in terms of cryptids, I know Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith discussed is it the Cadborosaurus, which is this alleged sea monster, and I think it was Vancouver, which was very prominent in the 30s. So at least there is one case of a what we would today call a cryptid that Lovecraft and Smith were interested in. But this is something I actually I might be writing something about that in the future. I think there's definitely something to write about with Lovecraft and cryptozoology. So maybe not keep watching the skies, but keep watching the pages, I guess.
Yeah, and of course there's the whole that Charles Fort is an interesting case. Lovecraft read several of the Charles Fort books. I mean, he thought they were scientifically nonsensical, but he thought they were really imaginatively stimulating. In fact, he read the first of Charles Fort's book, The Book of the Damned, right around the time he was writing The Color Out of Space, and there's maybe some case to be made that some elements of Fort got into The Color Out of Space, and maybe even later stories. So that's something worth further investigation.
And the founder of the Fortean Society, Theodore Dries, I mean, they had friends in common, him and Lovecraft. And said Paul, I'm forgetting who it was, but offered to connect him to and Lovecraft said, basically no thanks. So it was
Vrest Orton. Yeah,
Vrest Orton, yes.
Was I mean, he was a literary guy. He worked for the American Mercury under Mencken. Did a bibliography of Dreiser. So he's a big promoter of Dreiser and was a friend of Lovecraft's. And he said, okay. But Lovecraft actually had very little interest in Dreiser's work, because it was all about people. He didn't care about people. So yeah, so that didn't happen. In fact, Lovecraft had some near misses. He almost met a number of sort of important writers of the day, but didn't quite manage it somehow. The funny thing is, believe it or not, Lovecraft did meet L. Ron Hubbard in 1934. Hubbard, he was I don't know, teen. He was quite young then. Obviously, he apparently was at a party in New York City and met Hubbard. He briefly mentions him. He doesn't say much, but so there's the weird little connection there. I don't know if there's anything in Hubbard's work that would have inspired anything in Hubbard. But there it is, a brief association there.
Yeah, so there's a number of kind of near, like I think if it's always dangerous to say what if, but if Lovecraft had lived even a couple of years, I mean, I'm sure he would have run into Asimov and a lot of those other early Brooklyn science fiction club people. One of the times when Lovecraft's going to Florida, he has this kind of like near miss. He almost meets up with a number of early space opera authors, including Jack Williamson, who invents the word terraforming. Genetic engineering. So again, Lovecraft almost like encounters them, but doesn't. So it is interesting to speculate. Is some of these brushes that may have driven Lovecraft a bit further into the science fiction field. Maybe not. Also,
I think Lovecraft was writing pretty. I wouldn't say pure science fiction at all, but certainly the last 5 years of his life, he was writing mostly science fiction, although with a horror element in it. But and he probably would have gone further in that direction because, frankly, Weird Tales was rejecting a lot of his best work, including at the Mouths of Madness. Lovecraft was shattered when that story was rejected, but it was taken by Astounding Stories. Get a load of this. You know the story. Julius Schwartz, very young Julius Schwartz, was acting as an agent. He walked into the office of Astounding Stories and says, told the editor, F. Orland Tremaine, I have a 40,000 word story by H.P. Lovecraft. Do you want it? And Tremaine said, yes, without reading it. without reading it, which shows you that Lovecraft was a pretty big guy in the pulp field. Now the story, when it was published, got kind of a mixed response. Some people didn't like it, some people did. So whatever. And Tremaine did the same thing with the Shadow Out of Time. Donald Wanderai just walked into the office and said, "Hey, you want to publish this story, 25,000 words?" I said, "Yeah, sure," without reading it. So that got a somewhat better response. But anyway, very interesting. So.
Oh, I was just so Michelle had mentioned T. Kingfisher, but she also mentioned, are there other modern or authors who take a comic approach to Lovecraft?
I suppose there are. There's a guy out there named Mark McLaughlin, who writes sort of Lovecraftian humor, and some of it's kind of funny. It's a bit over the top. I think he wrote a little booklet called Shoggoth Cacciatore. Yuck, yuck. But I don't know. Lovecraftian humor is kind of a difficult thing. Lovecraft himself didn't feel that horror and humor mingled very well. He wanted pure horror. He thought humor was a weakening element. But Lovecraft, obviously, his stories are ripe for parody and satire and stuff like that. So yeah, there's stuff out there, but I'm not sure it's exactly the highest literary quality, shall we say.
Oh, and we also had an earlier question from James. Are there any earlier Ramsey Campbell stories you'd recommend that cover the cosmos?
Yeah, that's hard to say. Let me think. I should know this, but because I wrote a whole book about Campbell. There's kind of scattered, throughout his work. If you can find a volume called, well, Arkham House published a kind of a best of Campbell in 1993 called Alone with the Horrors. That has some really powerful stuff in it. I think a story called Macintosh Willie, one of the great, great horror stories of our time. I'm not sure how cosmic it is, but it's a tremendous, tremendous story. But specifically Lovecraftian stories that he wrote early on, and I mentioned these in Demons by Daylight. There's a story called The Franklin Paragraphs. Magnificent story. I mean, it is brilliant. To my mind, maybe the best Lovecraftian imitation, because it's not an imitation, but best Lovecraft inspired story that's ever been written. You just got to go read that story. It's so powerful and well written.
Oh, we had another question from Gary Davis. Any comment on the music that Lovecraft has inspired? There seems to be a lot of obscure, to me, bands that use his ideas.
Oh yeah. Speaking of that, let me. I don't know if I can find this book. There is a guy, I think his name is Gary Hill, um, who wrote a whole book on Lovecraft's influence on basically on rock music, mostly heavy metal. I can't remember the title of it. It's something Sound of Clue, whatever. It's out there. And he talks about Lovecraft's influence on Metallica and Iron Maiden and all these other bands, and even there was a band in the late '60s and early '70s called H.P. Lovecraft. I'm not sure what kind of music they had, but and they did like 2 albums, I think, before kind of dissipating. But and they're yeah. So Lovecraft, he's a figure in rock music, definitely, and a lot of bands have drawn upon him.
Yeah, I know there's like some heavy metal bands. Like there's one called the Great Old Ones.
Yeah.
And then there's one that blue I don't know how to pronounce it, but they came out with Lovecraftian echoes, and it's
Mm.
very ambient and kind of
Mhm.
uh, draw it brings about those cosmic kind of
Yeah.
themes in the ambient kind of music there. But William asked, you only have 3 books inside or outside of the cosmic for the rest of your life. What are they?
Oh, you mean specifically in weird fiction? I take it. Um, Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, you could cheat by saying, "Oh, complete stories of Edgar Allan Poe, complete stories of Lovecraft." I don't know if maybe that's cheating or, um, I again, I cannot sing the praises of Campbell's Demons by Daylight. Uh, uh, highly. That I would love to be on a desert island and just read that for the rest of my life. It's not even that big a book, but it's just brilliant. It's so brilliant. Um, what else? Let me think that really has affected me powerfully. As I say, I have a great admiration for Lord Dunsany, and that novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, is just pure poetry. I mean, it is a novel. It is a prose poem novel, if you can imagine such a thing. I could read that over and over again. King of Elfland's Daughter. Um, Specifically, gravitating more toward horror. Let me think. Man, there's so much good stuff. Well, again, I mean, Hodgson, The House on the Borderland. That's a tremendous novel. Again, it's barely 100 pages, but really, really powerful work of horror with again elements of the cosmic, although not throughout. All right. So,
Oh, and then just Derek said, thank you very much for your time. This has been very informative. I have some new authors to check out now. I can't wait to read The
yeah,
Tempting Providence and The
yeah,
Red
that's
Tree.
a great book, and Color Over Occam. Uh, all right,
Okay. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us. Oh, somebody also
Black
said
Feather. Yeah,
hello.
but I have some band.
Black
I've never heard
Feather.
of Black Feather, but yeah, they might be worth checking out.
Oh, Gary asks, is there a resource for locating anthology books that featured Lovecraft stories in the 60s and 70s? The first Lovecraft story I read was Whisper and Darkness,
Uh,
in a hardcover anthology I borrowed from my junior high school library. I wish I could identify that anthology.
uh, Oh, I did a whole bibliography of Lovecraft. I'm sure it's in there, but Lovecraft's been he's been reprinted so many times. I mean, it's all there's so many different editions of Lovecraft, and now since Lovecraft is considered to be, and I suppose he is in the public domain, you have all sorts of crappy editions out there. So stick to the authorized editions by myself, if I may say so. I just came out, well, not just about actually almost 10 years ago, Hippocampus produced what is called a variorum edition. I won't even explain what that is, but that's includes a lot of textual variants. But that has the most textually correct uh, editions of Lovecraft. So collected fiction, a variorum edition, 3 volumes, and then a fourth volume of the revisions and collaborations. The hardcover edition of that just came out. Um, and to my mind, that is kind of like the definitive edition of Lovecraft himself. Um, and I've done Lovecraft's essays, poetry, and letters. 24 volumes of Lovecraft's letters. My God, there's so much great stuff in there. You wouldn't believe it, but Lovecraft is one of the most readable letter writers you'll ever find. Just really, really good stuff, and very revealing about everything under the sun. I mean, about himself, his points of view, his travels. I mean, just he leaves nothing to unsaid. Yeah. Anyway,
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to Etsy Joshi for a great talk, informative talk here. Um, check your email because I'll have this book, signed
ah,
book, and I have a Lovecraft bookmark here that I made from our 3D
very
printer
nice.
at the library. So to raffle off, so check your email in the coming days, see if you won. And please check out our events. We have coming up. We have on December 5th. We have the scary talk with the author of the Scary Book of Christmas Lore. Um, so yeah, thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and have a great night.
Bye.